news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. My guest today is a freedom activist for girls and women worldwide. Dr. Tamara MC is a social scientist and linguist who explores how language is used to manipulate vulnerable populations. One of her own quotes is front and center on her website, stating, "I was a child bride. It's time to stop teaching young girls to stay sweet." As a cult, child marriage, polygamy, and modern-day slavery survivor and advocate, themes in Dr. Tamara's work explore coercive control, intergenerational trauma, religion and spirituality, and mothering. Dr. Tamara researches language, culture, and identity in the Middle East and beyond, and she's currently revising her debut memoir, Child Bride, My Marriage at 12. I'll also include links to her articles in the show notes for this episode. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast, Dr. Tamara.
Thank you so much for having me, Janice, on your wonderful podcast.
It's such a delight to get to finally meet you. And then I just realized I had heard you recently on Rachel Bernstein's fantastic podcast, Indoctrination. I just love that show. I encourage my listeners also to become familiar with the Indoctrination podcast. It's wonderful.
Yes, thank you. And we were just also chatting before and realized that we were in another workshop together. So these circles are so small. They kind of get smaller and smaller. So it's so nice to actually be able to sit here and get to chat with you.
Yes, agreed. And you have such an interesting story because your life was not run-of-the-mill, ordinary, average kind of grow up in North America life. So I'd love for you to share some about what it was like growing up for you, because your experience was so different. Can you maybe just start telling us a little bit about where you were? Were you in North America? Were you elsewhere?
Yes. So I grew up in the United States, and my childhood, I guess, seemed fairly normal until I was 5 years old, although it wasn't normal because my family came over as refugees. So I was the daughter and granddaughter of refugees. And so in that way, it wasn't normal. My grandparents didn't speak English. And so I did really come into like my younger years, like already caring a lot. So in that way, but then when I was 5 years old, before I had started kindergarten, my mother had gone away on a backpacking trip to Europe and left me with my father for the summer. And it was during that summer that my father came across a community that had just came to Arizona, where we were living at the time. And they invited him to their community center. And it was then that my life really changed. We ended up going every day after that and every evening. And we were both renamed. I was named the most beloved. And so very quickly there weren't children in the community at that time. And this is the late 1970s. So it was quite a while ago. So really at the height of like when utopian communities were coming up, they were sprouting up after Vietnam and kind of after the whole 1960s hippie movement. My parents came out of that. Mm-hmm. And so it was very natural for my father to kind of join this community that was very spiritual and was based in really what all seemed to be goodness and seemed to be like a higher, like getting, like my father was able to like tap into a part of him that he wasn't able to before through the spiritual teachings. And so by the time my mom came home at the end of the summer, my dad had adopted this new lifestyle and he wanted her to join, but she was not at all interested. She had just finished her master's degree and had started a career and was very happy with her life. And so then it was when they separated, and that was when my life really split apart and I began living these very two different lives.
Right. Yes. So, were your parents in the same state in the United States?
So my father soon moved, and our group was nomadic, so it traveled quite a bit.
Hmm.
The group ended up settling in Texas. And so I would then spend my childhood between Texas and Arizona. And that's how I would kind of split my time between my mom and my dad. So I had two very distinct and separate upbringings.
Right. And did you have any siblings?
So I'm an only child on my mother's side, but then my father married a woman and she had 4 children already. So I very quickly became one of 5, and that grew to one of 7. So it did grow. So my lives were really polar opposite in both directions. Like with my mom, I was just this only child, but then with my dad, I was just one of many.
Wow. Wow. What a shock that must be for a child to go from being the one and only to one of many. That would take a lot of getting used to. Or was it exciting, something different to have other kids around, or were they close to your age?
So we were all about the same age. I had a brother and sister that were almost my age. So several of them were my age. I was not excited to have more people in my family. When my father joined the community, I really lost him at that point when I was 5 years old, because the community was segregated between women and men, which also meant girls and boys. And so that summer, even though I was with my father, I wasn't allowed to be with him because I was a girl. And so I was taken immediately and I was brought to be with the women who were complete strangers to me, but I would spend all day and all evening with them. And I wouldn't actually see my father until the very end of the evening when we would go home. So I think like when my father then moved to Texas and he had a new wife and 4 new kids, and there was again this new huge community with all these people and a leader who was demanding his his time and energy, that it was just me getting less and less of my father. So in that way, I was not excited.
Wow, that is just heartbreaking, even to think of, for a child to kind of suddenly feel like they're losing their parent, or at least that closeness, that place that they had with the parent. That is just so challenging. And so you were now part of this group, and your parents had separated. Were you attending school? Did the group offer any kind of education for the children?
So there was what was considered homeschooling on the commune, but homeschooling really meant schooling in religious texts and religious languages. It was not actually in math and English and like regular subjects that would be studied in school. So on my mom's side, I was being traditionally educated. I went to just a regular low to middle class public school. And then on my dad's side, I would be homeschooled. I spent about 4.5 months with him every year. So I would be homeschooled on his side. Hold on one second.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, for example, like my sister, who was just wanted to learn how to read so much, like she didn't read until she was much older, just because there were no like studies in reading. And so I would like teach her how to read. So it was kind of like, and also because I had more schooling, or I actually had some schooling, I became in charge of teaching a lot of the children their studies. So I became one of the teachers, even though I was so young.
Wow, what a huge responsibility. So only, roughly not quite half the year you're with your mom and you're attending kind of regular school. And then the other time when you're with your dad, there's not really any schooling going on other than kind of the spiritual, religious aspect that they were trying to indoctrinate or teach all the children.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
And were the boys and girls also segregated when it came to schooling, or could little children be together?
No, girls and boys could not be together. So we were completely segregated. The
Right.
boys actually had a lot more schooling than the girls. So the girls really had much, much less schooling because the girls, and now I'm getting to when I'm a little bit older. So this is probably beginning at 9 years old, for example. So I kind of switched up in time, but already by 9 years old in our community, 9-year-old girls were considered women. And so we had women responsibilities, which meant that we were in charge of taking care of the little babies, because there was always babies, as there are in these sort of communities. There was lots of babies. So we were in charge of babies and helping to cook and helping to clean at that point. So there was really no time for the girls to have a proper education.
The 9-year-old girls were considered to be women. I'm just trying to let that sink in, because that is just inappropriate on so many levels, and so different, certainly for our typical Western mindset. It's very different. So now, were you able to continue with your education all the way through, up to your teens when you were with your mom?
So, yes. So my dad wanted me to live with him full time, and that was always the goal, and as did the community. But my mother was willing to let me visit my dad, but she wasn't willing to let me live with him full time. And so she pretty much said that I couldn't live with him until I graduated from high school. So that was the rule that I was given. And that just seemed like I was going to be so old. Like it just seemed like it was insurmountable to get to that age. Because at that point, I wanted to live with my dad because I had had so many years of like mind control. Like this is what I had to do. And like, if, with my mom was super liberal and didn't have rules and just wanted me to be a good person. But then when I'd go to my dad's, it's like you mentioned, I was just indoctrinated constantly from sunrise until way past sunset, because we'd have to stay, we were sleep deprived. So we'd get up about 4 a.m. and go to bed by midnight. So we were lucky if I got 4 hours of sleep. Like there was almost no sleep and there was no naps. Naps were not allowed. Rest wasn't allowed. So I thought that I wanted to live with my dad full time, because if I didn't, I was going to go to hell. And that was like what I was taught, that if I didn't follow all of these rules and I didn't do everything that they said, that God was going to send me to hell. And so learning that from the time you're 5 years old as this young little girl, it's like this huge fear. And I always was just a rule follower, and I would have never broken rules. So I thought that the way I was going to get to heaven was through living with my dad. So that was the reason I was in such a rush to live with my dad.
Wow. And, what a burden to place on a child, the whole concept, the whole threat and idea of you will go to hell ever. But specifically, if you maybe follow the ways of your mother. Did that conversation come up, or what was it like for you to be living in what sounds like quite a conservative group environment, and then going to stay with your mom who loved you very much and also happened to be quite a liberal person?
Yes. So yes, I was told that and it was always about, if I lived with my mother, I was going to become like my mother, which was like the worst thing that could have happened to me. That's what the community taught me, just because my mother lived in the world. So because she was part of the world and the world was evil, because she lived there, because she worked, of course she had to work. She was a single mom and had to support me. And so, obviously she had no choice. And just because my mom wore shorts, that was a horrible thing, because our clothing was controlled. We had to cover ourselves from head to toe. And from the time we were, before we were 9 years old, we had to cover every inch of our body as young girls, not boys, but as young girls. Wow. And so, so it was very much that my mom was living in sin and that I could not live with her because she was living in sin. So I was really afraid that like, oh my goodness, what if I become like my mom? Because they would tell me my mom's going to hell. And so I was going to follow her there.
Wow. So then what's it like as a child then when you're having to stay with your mom and she's nice to you, she's kind to you, she says loving things to you, but you're also trying to grapple with this idea that's been put in your head that she is evil, or she's at the very least on the wrong path?
I became quiet. I stopped talking. I became a selective mute when I was very young, which means that I only talked when I was spoken to. And so really on the outside, there was just pretty much this very, very quiet person that you like nobody really knew what I was thinking. But within me, I was just struggling all the time with these two very distinct and separate lives. And where did I fit in? And of course, what's the worst thing that a child could think of? That they're going to hell or their parents are going to hell. So that's kind of the worst thing imaginable. So I was just completely lost, and I had to not speak so I could work through things all the time within myself.
Wow. Okay. And so again, back to the time you spent with your mom, would you watch TV? Would you listen to the radio? Would you do things kind of that were considered more normal or regular in your secular kind of peer group?
So in the cult, there was absolutely no media. We had no televisions, no radios, not even books, and not even school books. So everything was controlled. Now, this was, the 1970s, early 1980s. And so there wasn't internet and all that we have now. So it was also much, much smaller. My mom had a TV in the house, but she watched the 5 o'clock news, and that was kind of it. So it's not like TV was really part of my life anyways. When I was younger, I mean, I would occasionally watch something, but it wasn't a big deal in my life, television. But really, after I pretty much became 9 years old, all the rules that I followed at my dad's, I'd bring back to my mom's. And so I'd pretty much follow the same rules. My mom wouldn't necessarily know that, but it was just within myself. I just wanted to make sure, because they would tell me that I couldn't, that people they would tell me that after 30 days, I would become like the people I was living with. And so it was this horrible thing that after 30 days, I would turn into my mother and into the outside world. And so it was almost like this threat, and also this sort of challenge, but maybe you're going to be the one that breaks this rule and can go more than 30 days and not turn into the people. So I was always really trying to stick to the rules that I was told, because like I said, I was a rule follower, and I thought that I loved God and I didn't want to go to hell. So those were all very good reasons.
Right. And they prescribed the clothing that you had to wear in the cult. Did that follow you to your mom's as well? Or did she have regular kind of clothing for you to wear when you were spending months with her?
It would follow me after a certain age. I didn't really have a lot of control over my clothes, because also my mom didn't have a lot of money. So it's not as if I had an option for clothes. I would just have whatever there was. We didn't have money. And so I guess in that way, it was just kind of what I could have. But then definitely at a certain point, no, I never wore shorts, and I was very covered up.
And I'm wondering, did your parents speak to you about each other? Did they speak poorly of each other, or did they just not really talk about each other?
My mom didn't talk about my dad. My dad in the community would talk about my mom.
Sure. Yeah. Wow.
And it wasn't about her.
Yes.
Nothing about her. It was just her being in the world because she didn't follow. So because she had chosen to kind of live that secular life, then she was one of, the masses of Westerners who lived in a certain way. So it wasn't personal about my mom.
Right. And It sounds similar to so many fundamentalist groups that are very, very fear-based. And so if you see, you're constantly concerned, if you step out of line, one footstep out of line, you're in danger. You're in terrible danger. And that is so confining and constricting and exhausting to have to all the time try and think about the rules. Am I following the rules? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it correctly? It's a tiring time. And you must have been very tired because you mentioned sleep deprivation, not allowed to nap, and from a young age, being responsible for the other children, the smaller children in the group.
Yes. And just the workload, because by the time I was we started doing all of the cooking. The young girls were in charge of all of the cooking for the whole community, which was about 150 members at the height of it. And so we were in charge of all of the cooking and all of the cleaning up of the dishes and putting them away and drying them and all of that. There would be a woman in charge, and I'm putting that in air quotes right now, who was kind of like our whip master, who would tell us what to do. So she didn't do anything. She would just tell us, this is what you have to do. So she'd just be chop this, do that. And so there was one adult in charge, but whoever that adult was always so angry that they were in charge. So they would just take it out on us.
Oh, no. Wow. So there wasn't really any nurturing that was going on behind the scenes that you would hope a child would be receiving.
No, I can't think of nurturing. There wasn't hugging. There wasn't kissing. We weren't put to bed. And in the commune, which I didn't mention, is we didn't actually live in a regular house. It was kind of like a dormitory. So there was a courtyard, and then around the courtyard, there was rooms, and then there was a communal bathroom and then a communal kitchen. So I didn't actually live in a room with my dad and my stepmom. They lived completely across the courtyard by themselves. And I lived in a room with all of my new siblings. And so I was just completely alone. So it's not as if we were even in a house where nurturing could happen. It was just the children were completely alone pretty much the majority of the day.
Wow. So, so then what happened as time went on? So when you got to be 9 years old, many more responsibilities and restrictions were placed on you, and you were caring for children and doing the meals and the cleaning, and I'm guessing still had to be available for all spiritual and religious kind of teaching and training that was going on. And you mentioned the boys didn't really have to do much.
They definitely didn't have to do as much as the girls, that's for sure. And yes, we were praying so many hours of the day. We'd have to stay up sometimes all night long in chanting sessions. We wouldn't even be allowed to sleep, and we'd have to sit up the whole time. And we couldn't even nod off in any way. So the religious part of it, that part of it was so strong. When we weren't cooking, cleaning, watching kids, it was the memorization of chants. There was so much memorization. There was so much stress in making sure that we knew these different parts of the holy book. And so we had to memorize them because that was going to help get us to heaven. And so always we were taught in the back of the mind, the back of our mind, we had to be repeating God's name. So at every moment, I was trying to remember to repeat God's name. And
wow.
So God had all these different names. And so we had to memorize all the different names of God. And so we'd have to constantly try to chant them within ourselves, as we were drying a dish, we'd be chanting God's names inside of ourselves. So it was all consuming. There was never a moment to just even it could be okay, maybe now I'm just washing the dish and my mind can wander. It couldn't wander. There was no time for our minds to wander.
Wow. And we absolutely need that. And especially as children, we need to be able to daydream and think about things and process things through play. Wow, that's just so much to think about. So were even the children not permitted to nod off or fall asleep or nap? What would happen in that situation if you or one of the children fell asleep?
Well, we were in circles. So there would be like a women's circle and a men's circle. And sometimes the man who was leading the chanting would come in the middle of our circle, and he'd kind of make sure he'd look at everybody continuously. And so if you nodded off, he could slap you across the face. He could start screaming at you. He could tell you to stand up. He could shame you. All things could happen. And then the women also within the circle, when the man wasn't in the middle of the circle, they always had their eyes on us too. Wow. So they could at any moment reprimand us.
No freedom whatsoever. Right. Yeah. Well, then if you would take us forward a little bit to the title of your book, being married at 12, what happened?
So sure. So when I finished 7th grade, I would travel to my father's house the next day. And so I traveled to my dad's house and just remember, this was my first year of middle school. So it was already super stressful. And the end of a semester, you have exams, and it was everything was new in middle school. And it's I had so much pressure, and I had lockers for the first time, all the things that a middle schooler would go through. And so right after I finished 7th grade, I went to my dad's. I went back to the commune. We drove there after I got off the airplane. But then I learned that the leader wanted me to live with him that summer. And the leader lived an hour away, and he had a personal residence. So he didn't actually live with us. And so he lived on a separate hill that was about an hour away. And he had 3 wives and I think 6 children at the time. And so my father thought it was such a great honor. No other child had been chosen. Here I was being asked to live with the leader. Nobody went to the leader's house, and I was being asked. And so my dad just took me the next morning, and I went through at that time, it was crazy because it was so long ago. But I mean, there was a metal electronic gate, which is unknown at that time, with an intercom. And so we'd have to be, my dad had to call in and say that we're there. And then after they knew it was us, the metal gate opened up, and my dad drove me up this hill, and it just kept getting steeper and steeper. And we got to one of the houses, which was the leader's second wife's house. And she just let me in. My dad knocked on the door. She let me in. And then my dad left, and I was just there completely alone. And I didn't know why I was there necessarily. I just didn't quite understand. But I quickly learned that I was there to watch the second wife had 4 children under 6 years old. So the second wife had 4 children under 6 years old. There was a 6-month-old baby and a 2-year-old. And I was there to take care of all of her children. And so the following day, there was what was called the playroom. And the playroom had no toys in it. There was just kind of a mattress on the floor. And I was just left with these 4 kids, and the door closed behind me, and I was supposed to entertain them.
With no toys?
No toys, books. Nothing. No books. No, nothing, just me.
Wow.
12-year-old me was supposed to entertain these, and not only just entertain 3 of them, but I had a baby that I had to hold the whole time. So a baby who couldn't even sit up.
Incredible. Wow. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that as a grown woman, let alone a 12-year-old that's just finished grade 7. That is just so wild. So then you're staying there with this family that you don't, the mom that you didn't really know, or I should say the leader's wife, not your mom. What were your interactions like with the leader and with the wives? Were they pleasant? Were they neutral? What was it like?
Well, I mean, I would only see the leader occasionally because he had 3 wives and he was going between houses and teaching. So it's not like he was very much part of my life, but very much the second wife was, because I was watching all of her children. And it was just as she was British and had a very heavy British accent and came from a very, very wealthy family, as did the leader. The leader had a lot of money. So like the community where I lived, like we had no money, like we were so poor, like so little food, but the leader lived lavishly. So I was suddenly in this gorgeous house, but I wasn't there as a family member, as a daughter, as, as sort of somebody that was there as a friend even. I was there as their servant. And so how I lived was very, very different than how they lived. And there was a room off of the playroom that was like a converted shed, like it was an outdoor shed. And that's where I stayed. And there was just a futon on the floor. There was nothing on the walls. And there was like a glass door that went to the outside that didn't lock. And the rest of the house was gorgeous and had like heating and AC and like whatever needed. But then like I didn't have anything in this little room. And and it was called the servant quarters. So I was just there as their child servant.
Yeah. Unpaid labor, exploited. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And so I wasn't special at all. There was no honor. I mean, like, I guess you could speak about there was an honor because they knew that out of all of the children, they could trust me because I was very responsible and very trustworthy. But that didn't work in my favor because it just put me in a horrible situation. Like, for instance, my sister, who was a similar age, she wasn't chosen, but they wouldn't have chosen her. She was completely rebellious and breaking rules all the time. And so they wouldn't have like had her live with them. They just knew that I would do anything that they told me to do. So my life there, so I was in this room. And then within the first few days, the first week, maybe even the first night, somebody snuck into my room, and it was the adopted son of the leader who was there. And there was nothing I could do. Like I was completely alone on this hill. Everybody was sleeping. It was at about midnight. I was sleeping in my little room by myself. And this person snuck in and began like sexually assaulting me. And that lasted for several days. And then one night he came in, and it was like after I'd been washing dishes and my sleeves were soaking wet. I was exhausted. And we were just sitting on the floor, and he said to me that he had to marry me because in like our culture, he couldn't be with me without marriage. Cause like we came from this purity culture where you had to be married to have intimate relations. And I mean, I was a girl who had never had an interest in boys. I had never kissed a boy. I hadn't held hands. Like I just had no idea what was happening. At that point, I just hadn't even thought about marriage. It just wasn't even in the back of my mind. It just wasn't even something I had thought about. And so kind of and then in a language that I didn't even understand at the time, he asked me to repeat after him, and I repeated after him. And within less than like probably 20 seconds, we had a marriage ceremony, because in this particular type of marriage, you don't need any witnesses. So it could just be the man and the young girl, for example. I'm going to say the young girl. So nobody had to be there. He could legally, when I say legally, I mean within our religion, within our belief system, he could be with me by just marrying himself to me.
Wow. Wow. That is incredible and horrible and confusing, I'm sure. And he was older than you. You were 12 and he was more of a closer to adult age.
Yes, he was older than me. He was older than me. He wasn't like a man, like he wasn't like, and a lot of these child marriages, the man is like 10, 20 years older, but it wasn't that case. So there wasn't a huge age gap, but there was a huge experience gap. Like he had lived with the leader. He'd been part of this community. He'd already spoken several languages. He'd lived abroad. Like he was a big person too. He was already tall, I think he had a size 13 shoe. And I think he was close to 6 feet. And I'm not, I mean,
Wow.
today I'm not even 4'11". So I was even teenier then.
Wow.
So
Oh
there was
my
like a
gosh.
huge like size difference. Like even though the age difference wasn't huge, there was a huge gap between us.
Absolutely. And so then he informs you that you're married, I guess, to him after saying the words. So then what happens? Do you just stay living there in the servant quarters and you're kind of pretending in public that you guys aren't together? Does anybody else know?
So yes, it was a hidden marriage. So during the days I was taking care of the kids, we also had a community. It's like there was a community building. So I would go there and like serve people and like work. And then I would come home by midnight, completely exhausted and ready to go to sleep. And then he would sneak over. And then by about 4 or 5 a.m., the second wife would wake me up and have me start to work again. So at that point, sometimes I would be lucky if I got 1 hour of sleep.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe you were able to keep going. That is a tremendous endurance on your part. Just absolutely incredible. So then what happened?
So that schedule went on for the whole summer. And then the day before I was supposed to fly back to Arizona, my dad picked me up and I went back to him for a night. And then I flew back to Arizona, started 8th grade, and I didn't tell anybody what happened to me. It was a big secret that I had to hold.
Wow. Wow. How incredible. It must have been so hard to go from one world to another world. And then you're surrounded by kids who are acting like kids and doing kid age appropriate kind of things. And you are now a wife and also looking after all these children. That must have been just an incredible shock to endure every time that happened. Mm-hmm. So take us, move us a couple years in the future. What does it look like for you?
Yeah. So the leader and him, they ended up leaving the country. And so a lot of my relationship with my husband became through letters. And then he would sometimes come visit me when I was at my dad's house. And so it was kind of this back and forth thing. Then when I was 16, I think I mentioned my mom I mentioned that my mom said I had to graduate high school. And somehow I figured out how to graduate early. And this was much before anybody was graduating early, like a lot of kids do now. But this was in the 1980s. And I learned how to graduate early. I graduated high school when I was 16.
Wow.
And I don't even know how I did it because like when I went back to school, I wasn't really in school. Like I was in my head all the time. Like I didn't even hear what the teacher said. I just remember that I would take exams and just somehow get through things. But like when I was 16, I was already taking college courses just to get like my English class, like my senior English. I was taking college courses. And so I was taking several courses in college at that point. I graduated early and then I went to go live with my dad full time at that point. And so I was just living with him. And then by then my husband had come back and was living in America as well. And so then our relationship was growing at that point in a different way.
Okay, so you were living with your dad and your husband came back, but he wasn't living on the compound or in the community where you guys were?
Well, we had a couple of communities. So he lived in a different community. So I was going back and forth. He was in a different state. So I was kind of going back and forth. And then he was coming to our state. So it was just kind of a lot of back and forth. But then when I was 17, I moved to where the leader was living because he had always his goal from the time I was 12 was to have me quit school so I could live with him full time and work for him full time. And when I say work, again, it's unpaid labor. Mm-hmm. And so I was always thinking that I was just going to live with him and his wife. And even though like, when I talk about it now, is like, how did I get through that? Why would I ever want that? But I didn't think I had another option. Like, being close to the leader was guaranteeing me getting to heaven because he was the closest to God that there could be. So I was the closest to God. And because I was like this chosen child, and I was the only one allowed in their house, and not only the only child, but they didn't even allow other community members. Like, my stepmom didn't even go into their house. Like, it was just me. And so I just really wanted to live with him. So I left the country and I began living with him and working for him and doing the exact same thing I did before. And he had 2 new babies at this point. So I was taking care of a new 6-month-old and a new 2-year-old. And my husband also moved to where the leader was living. So now we were also living together. So we were also reunited again. So this was that was how I got from like 16 until I was 20 years old. That was sort of that time frame.
Right. Well, what I'm really curious about is, how did you get out?
Sure. So when my husband was in America and I was out of the country working, he stopped writing me as much as he normally did. And I kept asking him, like, what's happening? And he wouldn't tell me anything. So by then, of course, I was in love with this person. Like, I had been with this person since I was 12 years old. This is like 8 years, like during the most developmental years of my life. And there was always this promise of like this life, this good life that we were going to live, and like how we were both going to live with the leader. And like, it just seemed like ideal. Like, here we were, these 2 people that only had access to the leader and to his whole family. And so I was really, really in love with him and just waiting for like our lives to take off in a different way and for us to finally get to live alone together, because we were still living in the leader's house. So we didn't actually have a normal marriage in any way, because I still was living in servants' quarters. Like, in the new house, there was another servants' quarter. I was living in that, which again was like this shed that was like, I don't know, they somehow put it together and there wasn't air or anything like that in the shed. So it was still like, there was still like a lot that hadn't happened in terms of a regular marriage between us. And so he didn't tell me what was happening. But then when he did come to live in Europe with me, I just kept asking, why, is everything okay? Because I could just tell he was different. He didn't look at me the same way. He didn't seem like he had that like sparkle in his eyes, like when somebody's in love with you and is like, he always seemed so in love with me and so excited by me and interested. And he no longer had that. There was just this dullness. And then one night when we were just sitting on a rock outside and I was begging him, he finally just said, I married another woman.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Oh.
So he had married another woman while he was in America, and he was now married to both of us. And I was in a polygamous marriage without my consent. And he just said that he loved her and that he was staying with her and that I had to accept it. Like, there's nothing I could do about it. And I just knew within me by that point at 20 years old that I could not accept polygamy.
Okay.
I could not. And it may seem like odd for somebody to know that, but this is a girl who was brought up in a polygamous cult. So polygamy was all over me, all around me. I'm sorry. So all of my girlfriends at that point were getting married off at 14 to men who were much older than them as second and third wives. And then the men would divorce them and then they'd be alone with babies. And so like I had watched so many of my girlfriends' lives fall apart. And I was like always in the middle of wives like talking about each other. So one wife would be talking about the other wife. And so that was within the community itself. And then when I lived with the leader, I was with him and his 3 wives who all hated each other. So I was like in the middle of all 3 of their worlds. And it was so stressful that I just knew no way do I want to live in polygamy. Like there's no way I could do this. And so that was really my boundary. And I just continued for months begging him to please leave her. And he just kept telling me no, that he loves her and he's not leaving her. And so that just went on and on. And then like the hardest thing I had done up until that point was I just decided that I couldn't do it and I had to leave. Like that was it. Like I just knew that I could not live like that for the rest of my life. And so I got on a plane and flew back to America.
Wow. Did you tell your mom you were coming, or did she know? It's such an incredible story.
Yeah. So my grandmother's partner at the time had died and they'd been together for many years right about that time. And so my grandmother was suddenly alone. And so I had an excuse to fly away because my step grandfather had died. And so in terms of with the cult leader, I had a wonderful story. And then kind of, I thought that I knew I was leaving my husband, but I thought I was just going back, but that I was going to return to the leader's house and continue to work for him. So I was really not leaving forever. I was just leaving my marriage forever, but I didn't even know what that looked like. I mean, what could I have really known?
Exactly. Yeah. So you flew to America, and then what happened?
Yeah. So I came back and I started waitressing, and then I found out that I could actually go to college, and it wasn't even something I had planned to do. And I found out that there was a course that I was really excited to take, and it was a 5-credit course, and that I could apply and I could go in part-time with 6 credit hours. And so I applied in my first semester. I took 6 credit hours. And then the next semester I took 12 credit hours. And then I think it increased where I was taking like 27 to 33 credit hours a semester.
Oh my gosh.
Equivalent of 3 full-time students almost.
Wow.
Because I was so voracious to learn.
Yes.
And I was so excited to be there that I graduated college in about 3 years, like after everything I had been through.
Wow.
And that was just where I loved university. Like when I went to school, like high school and middle school, I was so out of it. I didn't learn anything. Like even in elementary school, I don't even remember learning anything because I was always in my dad's community. Like I was always reliving things, even when I was alone. But then when I suddenly went to university, it's like, I felt like my mind expanding, like I could almost feel my brain cells growing. Like I could feel my skull, like actually expanding almost. Like there was expanders inside, and I just loved it. So it gave me so much joy. So that was really how I was able to begin healing, was through education.
Fantastic. And were you living with your mom at that time or other family members at that time? Were you starting to talk at all about what you'd been through?
Yes, I was living with my mom. I met my second husband, I believe, like my second year, and we got married. So we both graduated at the same time when I was a junior, but he was on a 5-year plan and I was on a 3-year plan. So we both graduated together. And right after I graduated, we got married a year before we graduated. And then when I graduated, I found out right afterwards that I was pregnant. And so then I had 2 children, right? Back to back. And so my life just kind of took off. And I didn't talk about my cult. It wasn't even part of my life. Like after I left, I didn't talk about my child marriage. I didn't talk about my cult. I just completely of course I went into college, but then I was married very quickly. And then I had these kids, and then my kids became my world. So like, there wasn't even a me. Like once you become a mother and you're nursing and you have back-to-back kids and all these responsibilities, like I only thought about my children. So I really didn't think about all of this until quite recently that I began, like it came back up in my life. Of course, it was always there, but I was married for approximately 18 years to my second husband. Mm-hmm. And we got divorced about 12 years ago. And it was incredibly sad for me because, I just wanted to be married forever. But by then my boys were almost out of the house. So it was nice. And I just had several years of healing from my divorce. So after my bachelor's, I went on for my master's and I went on for my PhD. And when I was going through the divorce, I still had like a couple of years left for my PhD. So I was so busy with that. And my boys were also like at the height of teenagehood, which is like so tough. So suddenly I was a single mother to these two kind of wild sons at the time, the most wild stage that they would ever be. And so I had a lot going on. So it took me, because I had to build my career from there because I still hadn't like built my career because I was still going to school. I was still raising my boys. So I still had to like build my career. I still, had to find housing for myself, like all the basic things. It's like I had to start over anew. And so really it's been in the last several years that now my boys are doing wonderfully, they're in their mid-20s. And like I've really been able to go back to my past and like really revisit what happened.
Wow. That it's just, wow. Your story is so much neglect, betrayal, exhaustion. I am really amazed by you, by the person that you are today, the person who endured all that and still had the will to keep going and growing and learning. And I know that motherhood is something that's been very important to you. And I'm sure you gave your sons a completely different experience growing up than what you had.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, their upbringing was night and day. I mean, I was in their life, like, I was there when they went to school. I was there when they came home. I was at all of their, extracurricular activities were so big for me to make sure my children just had so many hobbies. And like, I mean, they had so many toys. Like you talked about play, like their whole childhood was just one big playhouse. Like I had a whole room that was just like their costumes. Like I was obsessed with them having costumes.
And then love it.
Every single Lego, like just their entire lives were just like play because that was what I didn't have. So I just wanted them to have like a childhood. Like it's so important for children to have a childhood. Well
done, Mom. That's excellent. So we just have a couple minutes left. Can you talk a little bit about the advocacy work that you're doing now?
Sure. So, it wasn't, I began learning creative writing in the past decade. Like I was in academia, but now I've become a creative writer. And so I went back after my PhD for an MFA, which is a Master of Fine Arts. And I went to study creative writing at Columbia University in New York City. I was actually accepted into their program and it was like so exciting.
Yes, exciting.
So I've really been studying creative writing. And then through that, like I've been learning like journalistic writing. And so in the past really 2 to 3 years, I've been writing several essays in many different outlets that I've been published in. I have also begun working with different child marriage organizations, different human trafficking organizations. I've been speaking, I've been being on podcasts. Just pretty much, I've had people reach out to me from all over to share my story. And now I can really combine like my PhD work, kind of like I learned such incredible critical thinking skills through getting my PhD, which is something that I was completely lacking growing up in a cult. Mm-hmm. And so I've really developed that now I can I can read so many different things and be very critical about them and then be able to comment on them. There's just such a wonderful community right now, a fellow girl, and I'm calling them girl, but we were girls at the time, but like cult survivors who like grew up, like I grew up in this particular religious community, but it's almost identical to like another girl who was brought up in a completely different community. Like, it's so crazy how similar it is. So it's like all of a sudden, it's like I have this new community of women who are so strong, and they're just doing such incredible activism work. And I mean, it's just kind of being around them as well, and just us teaching each other.
Wow. So part of your healing journey has been creating or sharing community with other people who have similar experiences, who have also come through very difficult and traumatizing cult experiences. And I'm sure also you have read books related to cult recovery, or even I think of Dr. Yanya Lalich, Dr. Marlene Winnell, Dr. Steve Hassan, all really big names in the recovery field for people who are recovering from religious trauma and, of course, from cult life also, and coercive control. Tamara, it's been such a pleasure meeting you and having you on my show. Thank you very much. I hope that in the future you might be willing to address us at the conference on religious trauma sometime. We'd love to learn from you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, it was such a good conversation. So thank you so much for all of your questions.
And can you please tell our listeners how they might find you? Where can they find you?
Sure. So generally, you can find me on any of the social medias at either Tamara, Tamara MC, just 2 letters, MC. And so pretty much Tamara MC PhD. And I was on Twitter more, but now it's X. I'm not sure. But yeah, just find me. And and I'm always open to like share my story and to collaborate. So I really love doing that.
Wonderful. I'll make sure we get your links in the show notes so that people can find you. And I'd like to thank our listeners and our viewers for joining us today to hear this really interesting and important story. So thanks to you, Tamara, and thanks to you for joining in. Take care, everyone.